In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the features contained within the Spring Data project. We'll see how these features make our lives as Java developers much easier. Before discussing these features, I'd like to talk a little bit about the motivations behind the Spring Data project. The folks at Spring don't just create a new project out of the blue. They often look for a common concern amongst the Java development community, and then they will build a project to address that concern. So the Spring Data Project was created because the folks at Spring saw an opportunity to improve how Java developers access data. We built these applications and they all had some form of data persistence. We need to store and retrieve data. And the folks at Spring were able to make data persistence much easier by doing a few things. First, they simplified how we configure our access to different data stores. So you'll know if you've ever worked with a relational database or NoSQL database, you need to build out specific components. So for Hibernate, we have a session, or if you're using JPA, you have an entity manager. And those components need to be configured. We need to provide a port number, we need to provide a server name. There's all this configuration that goes into connecting to these data stores. And Spring Data provides a simple Spring based approach to creating those components that connect to the data store. Another motivation behind the Spring Data project was to provide a consistent approach to accessing data within our applications. So when you use Spring Data, the approach you use to access data within a relational database will look the same as the approach you use to access data within a NoSQL database. We'll see in a minute that we use the repository interface, and the repository interface provides us with a standard set of methods to access the data within our data stores. So our data access code looks very consistent across projects and within our applications. Now, while we have this generic approach to data access, Spring Data also preserves the specific features of our data stores. So, for example, if you're using JPA with a relational database, you can still write JPQL queries. Now, you can't do that for a NoSQL data store, but Spring Data allows you to use the features specific to the underlying data store you're working with. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get this generic approach, but you still get the features of your underlying data store. Another goal of the Spring Data project was to facilitate the construction of REST APIs. Many applications have moved to browser based communication where we're accessing data via AJAX calls or through JavaScript. And there have been components built into Spring Data that makes building these REST APIs much easier. Now that we know what the Spring Data project is trying to achieve, let's talk about some of the features that allow the project to achieve its goals. We mentioned the repository interface, and repositories are used to connect our domain object, our POJOs, our entities to our data store. So we have this object model or domain model, and the repository provides us with a familiar interface that we can use to persist data to a data store. Now, one of the neat things about repositories is that we can create these methods, and the name of the method will define a query that the Spring Data project can derive from our method name. So I can write something like find by last name, and Spring Data can inspect that method name and derive some query, like maybe something like select star from person, where last name is equal to some value. We'll see this in action in a little bit. It's a very powerful feature that saves you from writing a lot of SQL. Another neat thing about the Spring Data project is that it has built-in support for paging. So how many times have you wrote paging code so that you can access, let's say, the first 10 items in a result set, and then the next 10 items, and the next 10 items? Well, that's all built into our Spring Data repositories, and Spring provides the implementation of that paging feature for you. And it also works hand in hand with sorting capabilities that can be built into our repositories. As we mentioned before, there is a lot of facilitation for configuration of different data stores. So Spring's going to provide you with a lot of out-of-the-box features that contain the configurations you need to connect to your favorite data store. Spring Data also provides integration with Spring MVC. So if we are developing a web application, one of the best choices for building out your persistence layer is Spring Data because of the tight integration between the two projects. And finally, I can't stress this enough, but Spring Data provides you with a consistent approach to your persistence layer or your data access layer. And that allows developers to move from one project to another or one piece of an application to another, and they know what to expect as far as data persistence when they make that transition. It's very beneficial to your project teams and your projects to have a consistent approach in place to something as important as data persistence. And finally, you'll notice that this whole time I've been talking about data stores. I haven't mentioned any particular database vendor, any specific NoSQL implementation. That's the great thing about Spring Data. It connects to easily over a dozen data stores, some relational databases, a lot of NoSQL databases. So there is a wide variety of data stores that have Spring Data offshoot projects that you can use to connect to those data stores. And under the generic approach that we will see in Spring Data, it becomes pretty simple to switch out those data stores as long as you're not tying into specific features of those data stores. So we see support for things like MongoDB, Redis, Couch Database, Hadoop, Neo4j, and the list goes on and on. This is not an entire set of the data stores supported by Spring Data. Just know that there is great support out there for many data stores, and when you choose Spring Data, it's going to make connecting to and persisting data to these data stores much easier.